The Morning Post arrived at the Beresfords' flat in South Audley Street, with its usual mixture of bills, circulars, and the occasional letter from Tuppence's Aunt Araminta, who had opinions on everything from the Prime Minister's policies to the proper temperature for serving jam. Nothing interesting, I suppose? Tuppence Beresford asked without looking up from her toast and marmalade. She sat curled in the window seat, where the April sunlight caught the copper glints in her short, fashionable bob. Tommy rifled through the envelopes with the resigned air of a man who expected nothing, and was rarely disappointed. Gas bill. Something from my tailor that I shall ignore on principle. Advertisement for a miraculous hair tonic. Which you don't need, darling. And one rather curious item addressed to both Mr. and Mrs. Beresford. He held up a cream-coloured envelope with an air of mild triumph. The handwriting was old-fashioned, executed in violet ink with elaborate flourishes. Tuppence's eyes brightened immediately. "Well, don't just stand there like a statue. Open it!" Tommy slit the envelope with a butter knife and extracted a single sheet of heavy paper. His eyebrows rose as he read. "It's from someone called Lavinia Hartwell. Lives in a place called Meadowbrook, somewhere in Sussex. She says, good Lord, she says she's read about our detective work in the newspapers and wishes to engage our services in a matter of some delicacy." "Our detective work?" Tuppence laughed. "We helped find Mrs. Pettigrew's poodle last month. Hardly worthy of the crime pages. Nevertheless, Mrs. Hartwell seems to think we're the next best thing to Scotland Yard. She's offering £20 plus expenses if we'll come down to investigate what she calls a mystery of inheritance, art, and possibly murder." The last word hung in the air like a crystal chandelier about to fall. Tuppence was on her feet in an instant. Toast abandoned. "Murder! Tommy, we must go at once." "Must we?" Tommy assumed his most maddeningly reasonable expression. "We know nothing about this woman. It could be a complete wild goose chase. Probably some family squabble over a disputed will. All the better. Family squabbles are always deliciously complicated." Tuppence seized the letter from his hands and scanned it eagerly. "She says there's been a death. Her brother, Sir Edmund Hartwell, officially ruled as an accident, but she has doubts. And there's something about a painting with a hidden message. Tommy, a cipher! How perfectly thrilling!" Tommy Beresford regarded his wife with the weary affection of a man who had long ago accepted that peace and quiet were not to be his portion in life. Tuppence had the sort of restless, questing intelligence that couldn't bear an unsolved puzzle, and the courage or recklessness, depending on one's perspective, to pursue answers wherever they might lead. "When would we leave?" he asked, surrendering to the inevitable. "This afternoon, of course. I'll telephone Mrs. Hartwell immediately and tell her we're coming." "Oh, Tommy, don't look so gloomy. It might turn out to be perfectly straightforward." "When?" Tommy asked philosophically. "Has anything involving you ever been perfectly straightforward?" But he was already mentally packing his bag, and if there was a gleam of interest in his own eyes, he took care to hide it behind a facade of long-suffering husbandry. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, they were settled into a first-class compartment on the train to Meadowbrook, watching the London suburbs give way to the gentle green folds of the Sussex countryside. Tuppence had brought the letter and was reading it for the third time, her finger tracing the elaborate script. She mentions the painting specifically, a portrait of the family's ancestor, painted in 1789. Apparently, Sir Edmund was obsessed with it in the weeks before his death. He kept talking about the cipher in the eyes and the secret she's been keeping for over a century. Then he fell from the tower room where the painting hangs. "Convenient," Tommy murmured. "Suspicious, you mean?" Tuppence's eyes sparkled. Mrs. Hartwell writes that the painting has always been considered rather valuable, but nothing extraordinary. A competent work by a minor artist. But Edmund insisted there was something hidden in it. Some sort of coded message. And then he died. And then he died. Tuppence folded the letter thoughtfully. The police said it was an accident. He'd been drinking brandy. The floor was wet from rain coming through a broken window. He slipped and fell. But Lavinia, Mrs. Hartwell, says her brother never drank to excess and was sure-footed as a mountain goat. People's memories of the deceased are notoriously unreliable. We always make saints of the recently departed. Perhaps. But what if she's right? Tuppence leaned forward conspiratorially. What if someone pushed him because he'd discovered something in that painting? Something worth killing for? Tommy had to admit, if only to himself, that the prospect was intriguing. He'd been rather bored lately, truth be told. The post-war years had settled into a comfortable routine, and while comfort had its charms, so did a good mystery. The train began to slow as they approached Meadowbrook Station. Through the window, Tommy could see the village spreading out below them. A church spire, a cluster of Tudor-style buildings, and beyond them, rising from a wooded hillside, the grey stone walls of what could only be Hartwell Manor. There it is, Tuppence breathed. Oh, Tommy, doesn't it look wonderfully Gothic? It looks drafty, Tommy said. But he was smiling. They gathered their luggage as the train pulled into the station with a hiss of steam. The platform was nearly deserted except for a porter and a tall, severe-looking woman in her 60s dressed in black, who stood waiting with the rigid posture of someone who'd been taught that slouching was a moral failing. Mr. and Mrs. Beresford. Her voice was as crisp as November frost. Mrs. Hartwell. Tuppence extended her hand warmly. How good of you to meet us. Not at all. It's I who should be grateful that you've come. Lavinia Hartwell's handshake was firm, her grey eyes sharp and assessing. I confess I wasn't certain you would. The matter must seem rather far-fetched, put down in a letter. On the contrary, Tommy said gallantly, we found it quite compelling. Then you'll take the case. Tuppence and Tommy exchanged a glance. We'll certainly look into it, Tuppence said carefully. Though I should warn you, Mrs. Hartwell, we're not professional detectives. We've had a bit of luck with puzzles in the past, but luck allied with intelligence is all one can ask for. Mrs. Hartwell turned toward a waiting motor car, a dignified black Daimler. I've prepared rooms for you at the manor. I thought you'd want to see the painting as soon as possible. And meet the others, of course. The others? Tommy hefted their cases into the boot. The family, or what remains of it. Edmund's widow, Constance, his daughter Violet, and her fiancé, Captain Ashford. My nephew Gerald, Edmund's son, who's up from London, and Dr. Carmichael, who's been our family physician for 30 years. He was the one who examined Edmund after the fall. Mrs. Hartwell's voice remained steady, but Tommy caught the slight tremor in her hands as she gripped the steering wheel. They're all staying at the manor? Tuppence asked. Yes, we're in the process of settling the estate. Edmund's will was complicated. There are certain conditions that must be met before the inheritance can be distributed. She paused, then added quietly, I believe that's what got my brother killed. Mrs. Beresford, someone in that house murdered him for money, and unless we can prove it, they're going to inherit a fortune. The motor car wound its way up the hillside as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the ancient stones of Hartwell Manor, and Tuppence Beresford felt the familiar thrill of the hunt beginning to stir in her veins. Hartwell Manor rose before them like something from a medieval dream or nightmare depending on one's disposition. The original structure dated from the Tudor period, all grey stone and mullioned windows, but successive generations had added wings, towers, and architectural flourishes that gave the whole edifice a rather eccentric appearance, as though the house itself couldn't quite decide what it wanted to be. "Charming," Tuppence murmured as they pulled up to the entrance, where a weathered stone griffin regarded them with stony suspicion. "It's been in the family for 400 years, Mrs. Hartwell said, a note of pride creeping into her austere tone. "We Hartwells have always been custodians rather than owners. Each generation adds something and preserves something." Edmund felt that responsibility keenly. She led them through a heavy oak door into an entrance hall that smelled of beeswax, old books, and the particular mustiness that only centuries can produce. A grand staircase swept upward into shadows, and the walls were lined with portraits of long-dead Hartwells, all regarding the newcomers with varying degrees of aristocratic disdain. "Mrs. Beresford, Mr. Beresford, how good of you to come." The voice was soft, cultured, and belonged to a woman who appeared to be floating down the staircase in a cloud of pale blue chiffon. She was perhaps 40, with faded golden hair and the kind of delicate, ethereal beauty that always made Tuppence feel robust and practical by comparison. "Constance, may I present our guests?" Mrs. Hartwell said with careful formality. "This is my sister-in-law, Lady Hartwell. Please, just Constance." The widow extended a languid hand. "I do hope Lavinia hasn't been filling your heads with her theories. The poor dear has convinced herself that Edmund's death was somehow mysterious, when the truth is simply that he was growing rather erratic in his final weeks." "Erratic?" Tommy picked up the word carefully. "Obsessed with that wretched painting. Up at all hours, staring at it, making sketches, muttering about codes and secrets." Constance's laugh was like wind chimes, pretty and insubstantial. The doctor said it might have been the beginning of some mental decline. Edmund was only 53. But these things can happen. "My brother's mind was as sharp as ever," Mrs. Hartwell said coldly. "Of course, Lavinia. I didn't mean—" Constance's pale eyes filled with tears that may or may not have been genuine. "It's all been such a dreadful shock. To lose one's husband in such a horrible way." "Mother, you're not weeping again, are you?" The girl who emerged from a side corridor was perhaps 22, with her mother's fair colouring but a firmer set to her jaw. She wore a simple day dress of dove grey and moved with athletic grace. "Violet, darling, I was just explaining to Mr. and Mrs. Beresford. That father was losing his mind? Really, Mother, it's too tiresome." Violet turned to Tommy and Tuppence with an expression of brisk practicality. "I'm Violet Hartwell. You're the detectives, I take it. Aunt Lavinia's guests? We prefer to think of ourselves as interested amateurs," Tuppence said, warming to the girl immediately. "Well, amateur or not, I hope you can make sense of this muddle. Father was certainly acting strangely before he died, but I don't think he was mad. I think he'd found something real in that painting." Violet glanced up the staircase. "Would you like to see it? The portrait, I mean. It's in the tower room where it happened." "Very much," Tommy said. They climbed 3 flights of stairs, passing more portraits and the occasional suit of armour, until they reached a narrow door set into what was clearly the oldest part of the house. Violet produced a key from her pocket. Aunt Lavinia had the room locked after Father's death. She didn't want anything disturbed. The tower room was circular, with windows on 3 sides offering views of the grounds and the village beyond. The floor was indeed water-stained near one of the windows, where the glass had been recently repaired. But what drew the eye immediately was the portrait hanging on the inner wall. It depicted a woman in her 30s, dressed in the fashion of the late 18th century. Powdered hair piled high, a silk gown of ivory and gold, pearls at her throat. She was handsome rather than beautiful, with dark eyes that seemed to follow the viewer with unnerving intensity. "Lady Elizabeth Hartwell," Mrs. Hartwell said quietly. "Painted in 1789, 3 years before she disappeared." Disappeared? Tuppence moved closer to the painting, fascinated. Vanished without a trace. She left the house one morning to walk in the gardens and was never seen again. Some thought she'd run away with a lover. Others that she'd been murdered. Her body was never found. Violet's voice held a note of ghoulish relish. There have always been stories about her ghost haunting the manor. Tommy was examining the frame, which was ornate, gilt, and clearly original to the painting. "And your father believed there was a cipher hidden in this?" "He was convinced of it. He said the eyes, look at how they're painted with those odd highlights, contained some sort of code. And there are letters worked into the pattern of her gown, see? Very faint, but they're there. EHLST, scattered all through the embroidery." Tuppence stepped back to view the painting from different angles. The technique was competent, but unremarkable. The sort of society portrait that filled the halls of every great house in England. Yet there was something about Lady Elizabeth's expression. Knowing, secretive, perhaps even mocking. What was your father planning to do with this information? Assuming he'd cracked the code? Tommy asked. Violet and her aunt exchanged glances. "That's rather the question, isn't it?" Violet said slowly. "The day before he died, Father told me he'd finally worked it out. He said Lady Elizabeth had left a message, a confession perhaps, or instructions, to something hidden. He was planning to announce his discovery at a family dinner. But he never got the chance," Mrs. Hartwell finished grimly. A knock at the door made them all turn. A young man in his late 20s entered, handsome in a dissipated way, with the loose-limbed grace of someone who'd never done a day's hard work in his life. "Ah, the famous detectives have arrived. Gerald Hartwell, at your service." His smile was pleasant enough, but his eyes were calculating. "I do hope Aunt Lavinia and Vi aren't filling your heads with dramatic nonsense. Father's death was a tragic accident, nothing more. You sound very certain of that." "Mr. Hartwell," Tuppence said, "I'm certain that if Father had discovered anything genuinely valuable, he'd have gone straight to an expert, a proper historian or cryptographer, not waved it about at a family dinner like a parlour trick." Gerald's tone was light, but there was steel underneath. Rather insulting to the rest of us, actually, implying we'd kill for a few £1,000. "Is that what the painting's worth?" Tommy asked casually. "More or less. Father had it appraised last year. It's a decent example of late Georgian portraiture, but the artist was a nobody. Even if there is some cipher in it, what of it? A woman who vanished in 1792 is hardly likely to have hidden anything of value." "Unless she didn't vanish willingly," Tuppence said thoughtfully, still studying Lady Elizabeth's painted eyes. "Unless she was trying to leave evidence of something terrible." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken thoughts. "Well," Gerald said finally, "I'll leave you to your investigations. Dinner's at 8. Try not to accuse anyone of murder before the soup course, will you? It's bad for digestion." He sauntered out, leaving a wake of expensive cologne and casual arrogance. Tuppence turned to Mrs. Hartwell. "You mentioned conditions in your brother's will?" "Yes, rather unusual ones. The bulk of the estate, including the manor, goes to whichever family member can solve the cipher in Lady Elizabeth's portrait within 6 months of Edmund's death. If no one succeeds, everything goes to charity. Tommy let out a low whistle. That's quite a gamble. Edmund always did have a flair for the dramatic. Constance's voice drifted up from the stairwell, where she'd apparently been listening. It's just the sort of thing he'd do. Turn his death into a treasure hunt. So you see, Mr. and Mrs. Beresford, everyone in this house has a motive to want that cipher solved. But no one had a motive to kill Edmund. He was already dying. She appeared in the doorway, her delicate features composed. Dying? Tuppence said sharply. Heart condition. Dr. Carmichael had given him 6 months at most. So you see, whoever pushed him, if someone did, merely hastened the inevitable. Hardly seems worth the risk of hanging, does it? And with that unsettling observation, Lady Hartwell drifted away like a ghost herself, leaving Tommy and Tuppence to exchange a long, thoughtful look. Well, Tuppence said finally, this is becoming more interesting by the minute. Dinner at Hartwell Manor was served in a dining room that could have comfortably seated 30, but felt oddly intimate, with only 7 people ranged around one end of a massive oak table. Candles flickered in silver holders, casting dancing shadows on the portraits that lined the walls. More Hartwells, watching the current generation with what seemed like ancestral disappointment. Besides the family members they'd already met, there were 2 new faces. Captain Richard Ashford, Violet's fiancé, was a pleasant-faced man in his early 30s, with a military bearing and an unfortunate moustache. He'd been wounded in the war. Tommy noticed the way he favoured his left leg, and now worked for an import-export firm in London. Dr. Carmichael, on the other hand, was exactly what a family physician should be. Elderly, comfortable, and radiating an air of having seen everything and being shocked by nothing. He had a fringe of white hair around a bald crown, and the kind of shrewd eyes that missed very little. So, you're here to play detective, Mrs. Beresford. The doctor helped himself to more wine, with the ease of long familiarity. Lavinia's convinced poor Edmund was murdered, is she? Can't say I blame her. Hard to accept that one's brother simply had a tragic accident. You examined the body, I understand. Tommy kept his tone conversational. I did. Death was from a broken neck, consistent with a fall from that height. He'd been drinking, not heavily, but enough. The floor was wet. Simple as that, really. Except Edmund hated brandy, Violet interjected. Said it gave him indigestion. People's tastes change, Gerald said lazily from across the table, especially when they're facing their own mortality. Father knew he was dying. Perhaps he decided to sample a few final pleasures. How did you know about his heart condition? Tuppence asked. Your mother mentioned it this afternoon, but it seemed to be something of a secret. Constance set down her fork with careful precision. Edmund told me, of course. We were married for 25 years. One doesn't keep such things from one's spouse. And yet you didn't mention it to the police when they investigated his death. The widow's pale eyes met Tuppence's without flinching. I saw no reason to make his final illness a matter of public record. Edmund was a proud man. He would have hated being pitied. Who else knew? Tommy asked quietly. A pause. Then Dr. Carmichael cleared his throat. I told Violet, felt she had a right to know her father was ill. Medical ethics be damned. She's his daughter. And I told Richard naturally. Violet reached for her fiancé's hand. One doesn't keep secrets from the man one's going to marry. I discovered father's medical records quite by accident, Gerald added with a shrug. Left them lying about in his study. Careless, really. Mrs. Hartwell's face had gone rigid. Edmund told me nothing. His own sister, and he kept it secret. Perhaps he was trying to spare you, Captain Ashford suggested gently. He had a kind voice, Tommy noted. The sort of man who'd be steady in a crisis. Or perhaps he didn't trust you, Constance said sweetly. Edmund could be rather selective about whom he confided in, Lavinia. You must admit you and he hadn't been close in recent years. We had a disagreement about the management of the estate, Mrs. Hartwell said stiffly. It was hardly a blood feud. The tension around the table was thick enough to cut with a knife. Tuppence decided to change the subject. This cipher in the painting, had any of you made progress on decoding it before Sir Edmund's death? I'd barely looked at it, Gerald said. Seemed like Father's pet obsession. I've never been one for puzzles. I thought it was fascinating, Violet said. Father and I worked on it together sometimes. We'd catalogued all the letters hidden in the embroidery, but we couldn't make sense of the pattern. Father said the key was in the eyes, the way the light was painted, the specific angles, but I couldn't see it. And now you stand to inherit everything if you solve it first, Tuppence observed. Along with Gerald and Mother. If any of us crack the code, we all benefit, Violet's chin lifted. Father structured it that way deliberately. He wanted us to work together, I think. To remember we're a family. A family that might include a murderer, Mrs. Hartwell said quietly. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Gerald laughed, but it sounded forced. Really, Aunt Lavinia, you're being melodramatic. Who here would have killed Father? Mother? She was devoted to him despite his failings. Violet? She adored him. Me? I'd have inherited eventually anyway. His heart would have given out in a few months regardless. And you weren't even here that night. What about you, Captain Ashford? Tommy asked. Where were you the evening Sir Edmund died? The younger man met his gaze steadily. In London. I have witnesses. Had dinner with colleagues at my club. Didn't arrive here until the following morning, after Violet telephoned with the news. He paused. I wish I had been here. Perhaps I could have prevented it. Dr. Carmichael? Tuppence turned to the physician. At home, 3 miles away. My housekeeper can confirm it. We were playing whist until past midnight. Dreadful card player, Mrs. Hopkins, but loyal. His expression sobered. I'd known Edmund since he was a boy. If I'd had any suspicion someone meant him harm, I'd have moved heaven and earth to protect him. The door opened and the housemaid entered with coffee. In the brief silence, Tuppence heard rain beginning to patter against the windows. A soft, insistent sound that matched her growing unease. After dinner, Violet took them aside in the library. A magnificent room lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes that smelled of old paper and secrets. There's something I didn't want to mention in front of the others, she said in a low voice, glancing at the door. The night Father died, I couldn't sleep. I got up around midnight and walked down toward the tower. I thought I heard voices, Father's and someone else's. I couldn't make out the words, but they were arguing. Did you investigate? Tommy asked. I started to, but then Mother appeared in the hallway. She asked what I was doing up, and I said I'd heard Father. She told me to go back to bed, that he was probably just reading aloud to himself. He did that sometimes. So I went back to my room, and your mother. She went downstairs. I heard her footsteps on the main staircase. Violet's hands twisted together. The tower staircase is separate. It branches off from the second floor. If Father was up there arguing with someone, Mother wouldn't have gone that way. But she might have, Tuppence said gently, if she wanted to make it seem as though she went downstairs. Violet's face paled. You think my mother killed my father? We're not thinking anything yet, Tommy said firmly. We're gathering information. Tell me, who has access to the tower room? Is it kept locked? It wasn't then. Aunt Lavinia only had it locked after Father's death. Anyone in the house could have gone up there. Even servants. We have very few, Just old Bramble, the butler, and Mary, the housemaid, and Mrs. Cole, the cook. They've all been with the family for decades. But yes, technically, they could have. Tuppence walked to the library window, looking out at the rain-washed darkness. Your father's medical records, the ones Gerald found in the study. Where are they now? I don't know. I suppose still in father's desk? But when they went to check, the study was in disarray. Papers were scattered across the floor, drawers hung open, and Sir Edmund's desk had been thoroughly ransacked. Good Lord, Tommy breathed. Someone's been searching for something. The medical records, Violet suggested, or something else entirely. Tuppence bent to examine the papers. Most were mundane. Household accounts, correspondence with his solicitor, notes about estate management. But one item caught her eye. A letter, dated 2 weeks before Sir Edmund's death, from a London firm of art specialists. She read it aloud. Dear Sir Edmund, further to your inquiry regarding the portrait of Lady Elizabeth Hartwell, we have conducted preliminary research into the artist, one Marcus Blackwood. We have uncovered some rather disturbing information regarding Mr. Blackwood's activities in the 1790s. We would prefer to discuss this matter with you in person. Please telephone at your earliest convenience. Did he? Tommy asked Violet. Telephone them, I mean? I don't know. He never mentioned it to me. We should contact them tomorrow, Tuppence said, folding the letter carefully. This Marcus Blackwood, the painter. There's something about him that worried these experts enough to want a face-to-face meeting. A creak from the hallway made them all freeze. Tommy moved swiftly to the door and pulled it open, but the corridor was empty. If someone had been listening, they'd fled quickly and quietly. I don't like this, Violet whispered. Someone's watching us. Then we'd better watch back, Tuppence said grimly. Come on, Tommy. I want another look at that painting before bed. In the dark, with just a candle, the way Sir Edmund would have studied it. But when they climbed to the tower room, key in hand, they found the door already standing open, and Lady Elizabeth's portrait was gone. The theft of the painting sent the household into an uproar. Mrs. Hartwell alternated between fury and despair. Constance took to her bed with smelling salts. Gerald suggested calling the police, then immediately withdrew the suggestion when his aunt pointed out that their last visit had concluded with Edmund's death being ruled an accident, hardly the result they wanted repeated. Besides, Tuppence said thoughtfully over breakfast the next morning, whoever took the painting is almost certainly in this house. Calling the police would simply alert them that we know it's missing. You think they'll bring it back? Tommy spread marmalade on his toast with the careful attention of a man organizing his thoughts. I think they took it to study in private, to crack the cipher before anyone else can. They can't keep it hidden forever. Its absence would raise too many questions when the 6-month deadline approaches. They were alone in the breakfast room, except for Captain Ashford, who was working his way through an impressive pile of eggs and bacon with the dedication of a man who'd learned to eat when food was available. Violet's devastated, he said quietly. She and her father were close. Working on that cipher together was one of the last things they shared. How long have you been engaged, Captain? Tuppence asked. 3 months. We'd have married already, but Violet insisted on waiting until the estate was settled. Didn't want anyone thinking she was marrying me to escape family drama. He smiled ruefully, as if one could escape drama by marrying into the Ashford clan. We've got our own collection of eccentrics. Will you live here after you're married? At the manor? Good God, no. Much as I'm fond of Violet, I draw the line at living with her mother. We've a nice little house lined up in Hampshire. I've got a decent position with Carruthers Import-Export. Enough to keep us comfortable. Not the fortune Violet could have if she inherits, but enough. So you wouldn't benefit from her solving the cipher? Tommy asked casually. Ashford's expression hardened slightly. If you're asking whether I killed Edmund for money, the answer is no. If you're asking whether I care about Violet inheriting, the answer is also no. But if you're asking whether I'd like to see whoever pushed that decent man down a stone staircase brought to justice, the answer is emphatically yes. He stood, dabbing his mouth with his napkin. Violet and I are going into the village this morning. Mrs. Hartwell asked us to collect some papers from the solicitor. If you need us, we'll be back by lunch. After he left, Tommy and Tuppence sat in companionable silence for a moment. He's very protective of her, Tuppence observed. Yes. Question is whether that protectiveness extends to murdering her father. He has an alibi for the night of Edmund's death. Alibis can be manufactured, and we only have his word that he was in London. Tommy frowned, though I admit he doesn't feel like a murderer to me. Neither do any of them, really. That's the problem. Tuppence pushed her plate away. I keep thinking about that letter from the art specialists. Marcus Blackwood, the painter. What did they discover about him that was so disturbing? Only one way to find out. We'll telephone them as soon as... A scream cut through the morning calm like a knife. They found Mary, the housemaid, standing in the hallway outside Gerald's room, her face white as chalk. The door was open, and inside the scene was one of chaos. Furniture overturned, clothes strewn about, and in the centre of it all, Gerald Hartwell sitting on the edge of his bed with blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "What happened?" Tommy demanded. "Someone attacked me." Gerald's voice was shaky, his usual insouciance entirely absent. "I was sleeping, it's barely 9 o'clock, and I woke to find someone going through my things," I shouted. "They struck me with something, candlestick maybe, and fled. Did you see who it was?" "No. They were wearing dark clothes, face covered. Could have been anyone." He accepted the cloth Tuppence handed him and pressed it to his head, wincing. "This is madness. Absolute madness. First father, now this." Dr. Carmichael was summoned and pronounced the wound superficial but painful. "You'll have a devil of a headache for a few days," he said, bandaging Gerald's head with practiced efficiency. "But the skull's intact. You were lucky." "Lucky?" Gerald laughed bitterly. "Someone just tried to bash my brains in while I slept." What were they looking for, I wonder? Tuppence had been examining the room carefully. Your clothes, your desk, even your luggage, all thoroughly searched. "The painting, perhaps," Tommy suggested. "They might think you'd taken it." "Well, I didn't." Gerald's denial was sharp. "I've no interest in Father's ridiculous treasure hunt. Let Gerald inherit. See if I care. I've got my own income from the shipping investments Father set up for me years ago. Not a fortune, but comfortable enough." "Then why search your room?" Tuppence persisted. "There must be something they think you have." Gerald opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. "There might be. That is, I found something a few days after Father died. I didn't think it mattered, but perhaps—" He reached behind the loosened wainscoting panel beside his bed and extracted a small leather journal, water-stained and ancient. "I discovered this in the tower room, wedged between the window frame and the wall. Must have been there for years, decades maybe. I only found it because I dropped my cigarette lighter and it rolled under the window seat." Tuppence took the journal with trembling hands. The leather cover was cracked, the pages yellowed, but the writing inside was still legible. A woman's hand, elegant and firm. "The private journal of Lady Elizabeth Hartwell," she read aloud. "Begun this 3rd day of March, in the year of our Lord, 1789. If these words are ever read, It will mean that my suspicions were correct, and that I am dead by murder rather than misadventure." The room fell utterly silent. Tommy leaned over his wife's shoulder as she turned the fragile pages. The entries were sporadic, some dated, others not, chronicling the daily life of an aristocratic woman in the late 18th century. Social calls, household management, the changing seasons, but interspersed with the mundane were passages that made the hair rise on Tuppence's neck. He watches me constantly now. Monsieur Blackwood claims it is for the portrait, but I know better. He has realized I discovered his secret. I have hidden the evidence where only the clever will find it. The portrait will serve as both memorial and map. Let those with eyes to see understand. If I should disappear, let it be known that Marcus Blackwood is no mere artist. He is a... The entry ended abruptly, the next pages torn out. "Good Lord," Dr. Carmichael breathed. "She knew she was going to be killed." And she left clues in her own portrait to expose her murderer, Tuppence said slowly. "That's what the cipher is, not a treasure map, but evidence against Blackwood." "But Blackwood died over a century ago," Gerald protested. "What good does exposing him now do anyone?" "Unless," Tommy said quietly, "there's more to it than that. Lady Elizabeth wrote about evidence being hidden. What if that evidence wasn't just about Blackwood? What if it implicated someone else? Someone whose descendants might still have reason to keep it hidden?" They looked at each other with dawning understanding. "We need to find that painting," Tuppence said, "and we need to crack that cipher before someone else in this house ends up dead." The London firm of art specialists Hartley and Sons occupied a discreet office in Mayfair and specialized in what their advertisement called historical verification and provenance research. In other words, they authenticated old paintings and determined whether Grandmama's lost Rembrandt was actually a Rembrandt, or simply lost Mr. Hartley himself. The grandson of the founder proved to be a nervous sparrow of a man with thick spectacles and ink-stained fingers. He received Tommy and Tuppence in a back room, crowded with reference books and smelling of oil paint and anxiety. "Sir Edmund's death was most unfortunate," he said, adjusting his spectacles for the third time in as many minutes. "We were planning to meet with him the very week he passed away." "Your letter mentioned disturbing information about the portrait's artist," Tommy prompted. "Marcus Blackwood?" "Ah, yes. Most disturbing indeed." Hartley pulled a thick folder from a filing cabinet. "When Sir Edmund first contacted us 6 months ago, he simply wanted a valuation on the portrait. Standard procedure. But as we began researching the artist, we discovered some rather irregular aspects to his career." He spread several documents across his desk. Reproductions of old newspapers, excerpts from court records, letters. Marcus Blackwood arrived in England in 1787, claiming to be a trained artist from the continent. He set up a studio in London and began painting society portraits. His work was competent if unremarkable. He'd never have achieved lasting fame. But what is remarkable is this. Of the 23 portraits Blackwood is known to have painted, the subjects of 7 subsequently vanished or died under mysterious circumstances. Tuppence felt a chill run down her spine. 7? Lady Elizabeth Hartwell was the last. After her disappearance, Blackwood himself fled England rather precipitously. He died in France 3 years later, stabbed to death in a Paris alley, a crime that was never solved. "You think Blackwood was murdering his subjects?" Tommy asked. "I think it's a remarkable coincidence that 7 wealthy individuals sat for portraits by the same artist and then disappeared, often with their valuables mysteriously gone as well. Hartley shuffled through his papers. There was talk at the time, whispers, you understand, never proven, that Blackwood was part of a criminal gang. They would identify wealthy targets. Blackwood would gain access to their homes under the guise of painting portraits, and he'd gather intelligence. The layout of the house, where valuables were kept, the household routines. Then the gang would rob the house? Tuppence asked. Or worse. 2 of Blackwood's subjects died in what were ruled accidents. Falls downstairs, drownings. Their deaths occurred shortly after their portraits were completed, and in each case, valuable items went missing around the same time. Tommy leaned forward. Did anyone investigate this pattern? There was a Bow Street runner, one Samuel Craddock, who became suspicious. He interviewed survivors and witnesses, gathered evidence. But before he could make any arrests, both Blackwood and his suspected accomplices vanished. The case file was closed as unsolved. This runner, Craddock, did he leave any records? Yes, actually. That's the other remarkable thing. When we began researching all this, we discovered that Craddock's great-great-grandson is still alive. A retired solicitor living in Sussex of all places. Hartley checked his notes. Mr. James Craddock, residing in the village of Meadowbrook. Tuppence and Tommy exchanged startled glances. The same village as Hartwell Manor. Tuppence breathed. Precisely. We thought it an interesting coincidence. Sir Edmund was most excited when we told him. He wanted to contact Mr. Craddock immediately, see if any family records had survived. We encouraged him to proceed carefully. One doesn't want to make unfounded accusations about historical crimes, but Sir Edmund was quite determined, back in the motor car, driving through the late morning traffic towards Sussex. Tommy and Tuppence pieced together the emerging picture. So Lady Elizabeth discovered that Blackwood was a criminal. Tuppence said. She hid evidence of his crimes, possibly his accomplices' identities, somewhere in her portrait. Before she could expose him, he killed her. But the portrait survived with its secrets intact. For over a century, it hung in Hartwell Manor, and no one realized what it contained. Until Sir Edmund started investigating. He discovered the cipher, contacted the art specialists, learned about Blackwood's criminal activities. Tuppence's eyes widened. Tommy, what if one of Blackwood's accomplices was a member of the Hartwell family, or connected to them somehow? Lady Elizabeth's evidence could still be damaging to someone today, revealing an old family secret, perhaps affecting the inheritance. Dark secrets have a way of festering in families, Tommy agreed, and people have killed for less than protecting a family reputation. They found James Craddock in a tidy cottage on the edge of Meadowbrook, tending his roses with the care of a man who had time to appreciate small perfections. He was in his 70s, white-haired but spry, with keen blue eyes that lit up at the mention of his ancestors' investigation. The Blackwood case. I've been fascinated by it since I was a boy. My grandfather used to tell stories about old Samuel and his pursuit of the portrait killer, as they called him. He led them into a study lined with books and boxes. I've kept all of Samuel's papers, always meant to write them up properly. A bit of family history, you know, but somehow never found the time. He produced a metal strongbox and opened it to reveal bundles of letters, notebooks, and official documents, all meticulously preserved. Samuel was convinced that Blackwood had at least 2 accomplices, one who helped with the actual robberies and murders, and another, someone of higher social standing, who selected the targets and provided inside information about wealthy families. Did he ever identify them? Tommy asked. He thought he had. Look here. Craddock carefully unfolded a letter dated June 1792. Samuel wrote to a colleague about his suspicions. He believed the inside man was someone named Thomas Hartwell, a distant cousin of Lady Elizabeth's husband. Tuppence gasped. A Hartwell? According to Samuel's notes, Thomas Hartwell had gambling debts and expensive tastes. He'd have had access to information about wealthy families in their social circle. Samuel theorized that Hartwell selected Lady Elizabeth as a target, not knowing that she'd discovered evidence of the gang's previous crimes. Evidence she hid in her portrait, Tommy said slowly. Evidence that would have exposed Thomas Hartwell as an accomplice to multiple murders. Exactly. After Lady Elizabeth disappeared and Blackwood fled, Thomas Hartwell came into a sudden inheritance from a distant uncle. Convenient, that. He paid off all his debts and lived comfortably for the rest of his life. Craddock's expression was grim. Samuel could never prove it. The evidence Lady Elizabeth had hidden was never found. Because, Tuppence said, understanding flooding through her, it was hidden in plain sight all along, in the painting that hung in Hartwell Manor for generations, and now someone in the current family has figured that out. They thanked Craddock and hurried back to the manor, arriving just as the afternoon sun was sliding toward evening. The household was gathered in the drawing room, their faces grave. There's been another incident, Mrs. Hartwell said without preamble. Constance collapsed an hour ago. Dr. Carmichael believes she was poisoned. Lady Constance Hartwell lay in her bedroom, looking more ethereal than ever against the white pillows, while Dr. Carmichael hovered nearby with his medical bag and a worried expression. Poison is rather a strong word, he said testily when Tuppence pressed him. She ingested something that made her violently ill. Vomiting, dizziness, rapid heartbeat. Could have been a bad oyster at lunch. No one else who ate lunch is ill, Violet pointed out from her position at her mother's bedside. She'd been crying. Her eyes were red-rimmed and angry, and Mother barely touched the oysters. She had only soup and toast. Then perhaps the soup disagreed with her, the doctor said, but his tone lacked conviction. Or perhaps someone put something in the soup, Tuppence said quietly. The room fell silent except for Constance's laboured breathing. She'd been given a sedative and drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally murmuring incoherently about paintings and eyes and secrets. She keeps saying she saw something, Violet whispered. Something about the painting. She saw where it is. But she won't make sense. Tommy drew Tuppence aside. We need to search this house properly. That portrait has to be somewhere. They began a systematic investigation, starting with the most obvious places. The locked rooms, the attics, the cellars. Mrs. Hartwell provided keys and followed them anxiously, while Gerald, his head still bandaged, insisted on helping despite Dr. Carmichael's protests. Someone tried to bash my skull in this morning, Gerald said grimly. I'm not sitting idle while they make another attempt. The manor's cellars were extensive, dating back to the Tudor foundations. Stone-walled chambers filled with wine racks, coal bins, and the accumulated detritus of 4 centuries. Tommy's electric torch cut through the gloom, illuminating dust motes and spider webs. Nothing here but bottles and old furniture, he reported after they'd searched the 3rd chamber. There's one more door, Mrs. Hartwell said, indicating an iron-bound entrance in the far wall. But it's been locked for years. I'm not even sure we have the key anymore. The lock, however, yielded surprisingly easily to Tommy's picks, a skill left over from his more adventurous days. The door swung open with a horror film creak, revealing a narrow passage carved into the rock. Good Lord, I'd forgotten about this, Mrs. Hartwell breathed. The old priest's tunnel dates from Elizabeth's time, when Catholics had to hide. It supposedly connects to the church in the village, though I'm sure it's collapsed by now. But the tunnel wasn't collapsed. Their torches revealed a surprisingly intact passageway, damp and cold, stretching into darkness, and 10 feet in, leaning against the wall as though someone had just set it down, was Lady Elizabeth's portrait. Tuppence felt a thrill of triumph mixed with unease. Someone hid it here, recently. Look, there are fresh footprints in the dust. They carried the painting carefully back through the tunnel and into better light. In the harsh glare of the electric bulbs, Lady Elizabeth's face seemed more mocking than ever, her painted eyes glittering with secrets. Now we can examine it properly, Tommy said. Study the cipher without worrying about someone stealing it again. But as they climbed the cellar stairs, a sound made them freeze, the heavy thud of the manor's front door slamming shut, followed by running footsteps. They burst into the entrance hall to find Captain Ashford standing there, dishevelled and breathless, his clothes muddy and torn. "Someone tried to kill me," he gasped. "On the road from the village, a motor car came out of nowhere, tried to run me down. I jumped into a ditch. By the time I climbed out, they were gone." Violet rushed to him, and he pulled her close with shaking hands. "I'm all right, dearest, just shaken. But whoever's behind this is getting desperate." They assembled in the library, the household's unofficial war room, and laid the portrait on a large table where they could all examine it. Tuppence had retrieved Lady Elizabeth's journal from Gerald's room, and now she placed it beside the painting. Lady Elizabeth knew she was in danger, she explained to the group. She discovered that Marcus Blackwood, the artist who painted this portrait, was part of a criminal gang, along with a Hartwell family member named Thomas. A collective gasp ran through the room. "Thomas Hartwell!" Mrs. Hartwell's voice was sharp. "But he's our ancestor, great-great-grandfather to my generation. He was also, we believe, an accomplice to murder and robbery. Lady Elizabeth found evidence of this, and hid it in her portrait before Blackwood could silence her. But he killed her anyway, and the secret remained hidden for over a century. Until Father started investigating," Violet said slowly. "He discovered what the painting contained and someone killed him to keep it secret," Gerald finished. "But who? What does it matter now what Thomas Hartwell did in 1792? "It matters," Tommy said, "if that secret affects the current inheritance. Remember, Sir Edmund's will states that whoever solves the cipher inherits the estate. What if solving it reveals something that would invalidate certain claims, or expose a family scandal so damaging that someone would kill to prevent it?" "But we're all Hartwells here," Constance said weakly from the doorway, where she'd appeared wrapped in a dressing gown, supported by Mary the maid. Her face was still pale, but her eyes were alert. "Whatever shame Thomas brought on the family affects all of us equally." "Does it?" Tuppence studied each face in turn. "Are you quite certain everyone here is who they claim to be?" The silence was profound. Then Dr. Carmichael cleared his throat. "If I might make a suggestion, perhaps we should focus on actually solving this cipher rather than speculating about motives. Once we know what the secret is, the question of who's trying to hide it may become obvious." "Agreed," Tommy said. "Right then, let's have a proper look at this painting." They spent the next hour examining every inch of the canvas. The letters woven into the embroidery of Lady Elizabeth's gown were clearly visible once you knew to look for them. EHLSTAR, a W scattered throughout the painted fabric with no apparent pattern. "They spell nothing coherent," Gerald said in frustration. Just random letters. Not random, Violet said suddenly. Look, if you connect them in the order they appear from top to bottom, left to right, they spell West Hearth. Tuppence felt her heart race. The West Hearth. There's a fireplace on the west wall of the Great Hall, isn't there? They practically ran to the Great Hall. A magnificent room with a vaulted ceiling and a massive stone fireplace carved with the Hartwell coat of arms. Tommy began examining the stonework, pressing and prodding, while Tuppence held Lady Elizabeth's journal, reading by candlelight. The evidence lies where warmth and stone embrace, where the innocent suffer and the guilty prosper, she read. That's her last clear entry. The hearthstone! Tommy dropped to his knees and began working at the large flagstone directly in front of the fireplace. With Gerald's help and a crowbar from the servants' quarters, they managed to lever it up. Beneath was a small cavity in the foundation, and inside, wrapped in oilcloth and perfectly preserved, was a bundle of letters, a ledger, and a heavy gold ring engraved with initials. T. H. Tommy lifted out the ledger and opened it carefully. Inside were columns of names, dates, and amounts, accounts of robberies, and in several cases, murders. Each entry was signed with 2 sets of initials, M.B. and T.H. Marcus Blackwood and Thomas Hartwell. Tuppence breathed. A complete record of their crimes. And tucked inside the ledger was one more document. A marriage certificate dated 1788, uniting Marcus Blackwood and one Sarah Hartwell, Thomas's younger sister. Good God, Mrs. Hartwell whispered. Sarah Hartwell married the man who murdered Lady Elizabeth. And if they had children, Tommy said slowly, those descendants would have a very good reason indeed to want this evidence to remain hidden. A floorboard creaked behind them. They turned to find Constance standing in the doorway, no longer looking pale and ethereal, but focused and dangerous. In her hand was a small pistol, and it was pointed directly at them. You should have left it alone, she said quietly. All of you. Some secrets are meant to stay buried. The pistol was small, a lady's weapon, designed more for dramatic effect than serious harm. But at this distance, Tuppence reflected, even a lady's pistol could kill. Constance. Put that down, Mrs. Hartwell said sharply. Have you gone completely mad? Mad? Constance laughed, a brittle sound. No, Lavinia, I've never been more sane. I've been trying to prevent this moment for weeks. Months, actually, since Edmund first started obsessing over that damned painting. You killed him. Violet's voice was barely a whisper. You killed Father. I had no choice. He was going to announce his discovery, expose everything. Do you know what it would have done to our family? To our position? If the world learned that we're descended from murderers and thieves? We? Tommy's mind was working rapidly, fitting pieces together. You mean you specifically? Your maiden name, what was it? Blackwell, Constance said flatly. Or, as it was originally spelled, Blackwood. Marcus Blackwood was my great-great-great-grandfather. Sarah Hartwell was my great-great-great-grandmother. They fled to France after Lady Elizabeth's disappearance, changed their name slightly, and eventually their grandson returned to England. We've been respectable for generations. No one remembered the connection. But Edmund discovered it, Tuppence said. Edmund discovered everything. He cracked the cipher, found the evidence, traced the genealogies. He was so proud of himself solving a century-old mystery. He didn't care that it would destroy me, expose Violet as the descendant of criminals, ruin any chance she had of a good marriage. I don't give a damn about that, Violet cried. How could you think I'd value social standing over Father's life? You say that now, but wait until society cuts you, until doors close, until every introduction comes with whispers about your family's dark past. Constance's hand trembled, but the pistol remained steady. I grew up hearing those whispers about distant relatives who'd done something shameful. I clawed my way to respectability by marrying Edmund. I won't let it be taken away. So you pushed him down the stairs, Tommy said, keeping his voice calm and conversational, the night he was going to reveal his discovery. It was an accident, Constance said, but her voice cracked. I only meant to reason with him, make him see sense. But he wouldn't listen. He said the truth mattered more than reputation. We struggled and he fell. I didn't mean to kill him. But you let everyone believe it was an accident, Mrs. Hartwell said coldly. You lied to the police, to the family, to your own daughter. What else could I do? Confess and go to the gallows? Leave Violet alone in the world with a murderess for a mother? You stole the painting to prevent anyone else from solving the cipher, Tuppence said, and you attacked Gerald when he got too close to the truth. I thought he'd found Lady Elizabeth's journal. I knew it had to exist somewhere. Edmund mentioned it. When I saw Gerald's room had been searched earlier, I assumed someone else was looking for the same evidence I was, so I tried to find it myself. She smiled bitterly. I even poisoned myself to throw off suspicion. A small dose of ipecac makes you dreadfully ill but isn't dangerous. Dr. Carmichael was so concerned, insisted I rest. It gave me an alibi while I moved the painting to the cellars. And Captain Ashford? Violet demanded. Did you try to kill him too? No, that wasn't me. I swear it. For the first time, Constance looked genuinely frightened. Someone else knows, don't you see? Someone else is trying to silence everyone who might discover the truth. A sound from the doorway made them all turn. Dr. Carmichael stood there, and his comfortable grandfatherly expression had transformed into something cold and calculating. She's quite right, he said pleasantly. I'm afraid I'm the one who attempted to remove Captain Ashford from the equation. Sloppy of me. I should have realized he'd be too quick to dodge. Military training and all that. Dr. Carmichael? Mrs. Hartwell looked stunned. But why? Because I'm also descended from Thomas Hartwell, dear lady. Through his illegitimate daughter. He had rather a lot of those, I'm afraid. The respectable Hartwells don't know about our branch of the family tree. We've kept quiet, worked as doctors and solicitors and teachers, always on the periphery of the family. And we've waited. He pulled a larger, more serious pistol from his medical bag. When Edmund's will was read, and I learned about the cipher competition, I realized this was my chance. If I could solve the puzzle, I could claim the estate as a Hartwell descendant. But I needed to eliminate the competition, and I certainly couldn't allow the evidence of Thomas's crimes to come to light. My entire career would be destroyed if people learned my ancestor was a murderer. So you pushed Edmund? Tommy asked. No, that was all Constance's doing. Rather convenient for me, actually. But I've been trying to discourage further investigation ever since. The attack on Gerald, the attempt on Ashford, even putting pressure on certain medical records that might have raised questions about Edmund's accident. He sighed. Unfortunately, you've all been most persistent, and now you've found the evidence, which means I have no choice but to ensure you can't share it. You're going to shoot all of us? Tuppence asked incredulously. In the middle of Hartwell Manor? How exactly do you plan to explain that? Gas explosion, Carmichael said calmly. This old house, ancient pipes, tragic accident. The manor burns, destroying all evidence of Thomas Hartwell's crimes. And the authorities will assume Edmund's treasure hunt died with his family. Quite neat, really. Except for one problem, Tommy said. The art specialists in London have copies of all their research, and Mr. Craddock has his ancestors' complete investigation files. Even if we all die, the truth will eventually come out." Carmichael's expression flickered with doubt, and in that moment of hesitation, Captain Ashford, who'd been edging slowly along the wall, lunged forward and knocked the pistol from his hand. What followed was chaos. Gerald grabbed Constance's weapon. Tommy tackled Carmichael. Violet was screaming. Mrs. Hartwell was demanding someone fetch the police immediately. When the dust settled, literally, as a considerable amount had been disturbed in the scuffle, Carmichael was bound with curtain cords, and Constance had collapsed into hysterical weeping. "I didn't mean to kill him," she kept repeating. "I loved Edmund. I just couldn't let him destroy everything." "Love," Tuppence observed to Tommy as they waited for the village constable to arrive, "makes people do the most illogical things. Present company accepted, I hope? Oh, I'm deeply logical about you, darling. That's why I married you." The constable, when he finally arrived on his bicycle, was overwhelmed by the situation and immediately telephoned for assistance from the county police. By midnight, Hartwell Manor was crawling with officers, and Constance and Dr. Carmichael had been taken into custody. Violet was brave about it, Tommy noted. She held her head high as her mother was led away, and though her eyes were red from crying, she didn't break down. "At least now I know the truth," she said to Tuppence. "That's worth something, isn't it?" "The truth is always worth something," Tuppence said gently, "though sometimes it's damned inconvenient." 2 days later, with Constance and Dr. Carmichael awaiting trial, and the county police having completed their investigation, the remaining members of the household gathered in the library for what Tommy called tying up loose ends, and Tuppence called the proper Christie style. Conclusion: Inspector Morrison from the county. Constabulary had been invited, along with the family solicitor, Mr. Penrose, a dry stick of a man who'd been managing the Hartwell estate for 30 years and looked thoroughly rattled by recent events. "I still don't entirely understand," Mrs. Hartwell said, accepting a cup of tea from the restored Mary. "How did Edmund actually discover the connection between Constance and Marcus Blackwood? The name change, the genealogy." Tommy stood by the fireplace, falling naturally into the role of great detective, while Tuppence curled in a chair with Lady Elizabeth's journal. "It started with the painting itself," Tommy explained. "Edmund noticed the cipher in Lady Elizabeth's eyes, a series of tiny symbols painted into the highlights. They're based on a classical substitution code popular in the late 18th century. When decoded, they spell out, 'Evidence beneath West Hearth proves MB and TH guilty of murder, most foul.'" "But that was only the first layer," Tuppence added. "The letters in the gown embroidery provided the specific location, and Lady Elizabeth's journal provided context. Who Blackwood was, what crimes he'd committed. Once Edmund had the evidence from beneath the hearthstone," Tommy continued, "he began researching. The ledger contained references to Blackwood's wife, Sarah Hartwell. From there, it was simply a matter of tracing descendants through parish records and genealogical databases." "He must have discovered Constance's connection first," Inspector Morrison said. "And confronted her? Actually, no. We believe he was still researching when he died. He'd contacted the art specialists, visited the parish records office, even written to genealogical societies. But he hadn't yet made the connection to Constance or to Dr. Carmichael." "Then how did Constance know he'd found out about her?" Violet asked. "She didn't," Tuppence said. "Not specifically, but Edmund mentioned at dinner one evening that he'd discovered something shocking about the family history. Something that would redraw the family tree, as he put it." Constance panicked. She'd always known about her connection to Blackwood. Her grandfather had told her on his deathbed, warning her never to reveal it. When Edmund started talking about family secrets and genealogies, she assumed the worst. So she confronted him that night, Tommy said, in the tower room, where he'd been studying the painting. They argued. She tried to convince him to suppress whatever he'd found. He refused. They struggled near the window, the one with the broken latch that let in rain, and Edmund fell. Or was pushed, Inspector Morrison amended grimly. The medical evidence could support either scenario, Tommy admitted, but Constance's own confession makes it clear she was responsible for his death, whether she intended murder or simply manslaughter. And Dr. Carmichael? Gerald asked. He was still wearing his bandage, a rakish touch that he'd begun to wear with a certain pride. When did he get involved? Carmichael became suspicious when he examined Edmund's body, Tuppence said. He noticed that the injuries didn't quite match a simple fall. There were bruises on Edmund's arms, suggesting he'd been grabbed or struggled with someone. Being the local doctor and Edmund's friend, he was called in immediately and saw things the police might have missed. But instead of reporting his suspicions, he investigated privately, Tommy continued. He had his own secrets to protect after all. He'd known about his connection to Thomas Hartwell for years. It was the family skeleton in his closet. When he heard about Edmund's cipher investigation and the terms of the will, he realized the evidence might be about to surface. So he started trying to prevent anyone else from solving the cipher, Mrs. Hartwell said. Exactly. He thought if he could eliminate the obvious heirs and solve the puzzle himself, he could claim the estate and destroy the evidence of Thomas's crimes before anyone else saw it. Tommy's expression was grim. He nearly succeeded. If Constance hadn't panicked and stolen the painting, giving us a clear indication that someone in the house was desperate to hide something, we might not have investigated so thoroughly. 2 murderers in one house, Gerald said wonderingly, though technically Constance is only guilty of manslaughter, while Carmichael was actively trying to commit murder, multiple times. The courts will sort out the legal distinctions, Inspector Morrison said. What matters is that justice has been served, and Sir Edmund's death has been properly investigated and explained. Mr. Penrose cleared his throat diplomatically. There is still the matter of the estate. With Lady Hartwell in custody and unlikely to inherit, and Dr. Carmichael's claim invalidated by his criminal actions, the terms of the will must be addressed. Technically, young Gerald and Miss Violet solved the cipher. Or rather, Mr. and Mrs. Beresford did on their behalf. We couldn't have done it without Edmund's groundwork, Tuppence said firmly. He'd already cracked the basic code. We simply followed his leads. Be that as it may, the solicitor continued, the will specifies that the estate goes to whoever solves the cipher. Mrs. Hartwell suggested in her original letter that you be paid £20 for your investigative services, but given that you've effectively secured the inheritance for Miss Violet and Mr. Gerald, perhaps a more substantial reward is in order. Brother and sister exchanged glances. We'll split the estate as father intended, Violet said. And yes, Mr. and Mrs. Beresford should be properly compensated. Shall we say £1,000? Far too generous, Tommy protested. But Tuppence kicked his ankle gently. Extremely generous, she corrected smoothly. We accept, Gerald grinned. Consider it a finder's fee. After all, you found a murderer, 2 murderers, and solved a century-old mystery. Worth every penny. There's one more thing, Mrs. Hartwell said quietly. Lady Elizabeth's portrait. What should we do with it? They all looked at the painting, which had been rehung in the library. Lady Elizabeth's dark eyes still held their secrets, her expression still mocking. But now there was something else in her painted face, a kind of triumph. "We could donate it to a museum," Violet suggested, "with the full story of the cipher and the crimes it exposed. Let her have her vindication after all these years." "I think she'd like that," Tuppence said softly. "She tried so hard to leave evidence behind, to ensure the truth would come out eventually. It took 133 years, but she succeeded. To Lady Elizabeth." Tommy raised his teacup in salute. May she rest in peace, knowing justice was finally served. They all drank to that, even the practical Inspector Morrison. As the meeting broke up and people began to drift away, Violet pulled Tuppence aside. "Thank you," she said simply, "for giving me back my father's reputation, for proving he wasn't just obsessed or going mad, but actually onto something real and important." "He was a brave man," Tuppence said, "and clever. He saw what others had missed for more than a century." "He'd have liked you," Violet said. "Both of you. He always appreciated people who asked questions and didn't accept easy answers." "Then we were honoured to finish his work," Tuppence said. "The Trial of Constance, Lady Hartwell and Dr. James Carmichael became something of a sensation in the newspapers. The story had everything: aristocratic intrigue, hidden ciphers, century-old crimes, and a portrait with secrets. Reporters from London descended on Meadowbrook like locusts, and the quiet village found itself thrust into the spotlight. Tommy and Tuppence were called to testify, of course. They spent 2 days in the witness box, recounting their investigation, with appropriate gravity while journalists scribbled frantically, and the public gallery hung on every word. Constance's defence was manslaughter. She'd never intended to kill Edmund, only to reason with him. The struggle had been an accident. Her barrister painted her as a desperate woman trying to protect her daughter's future, driven to a tragic mistake by maternal love and social pressure. The jury was sympathetic. She was convicted of manslaughter rather than murder, and sentenced to 12 years' imprisonment. Dr. Carmichael's trial was less sympathetic. The evidence of his deliberate attempts to murder Captain Ashford and Gerald was overwhelming. His motivation, protecting his family's reputation and attempting to claim the Hartwell estate through violence, earned him no mercy. He was convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to hang, though the sentence will likely be commuted to life imprisonment, Tommy explained to Tuppence as they read the verdict in the morning papers. They rarely hang elderly physicians these days. Bad for public morale. He deserves worse, Tuppence said flatly. He tried to kill at least 2 people and showed no remorse whatsoever. They were back in their London flat, having returned from Sussex the previous week. The Hartwell case was officially closed, their testimony complete, their substantial fee safely deposited in the bank. Life, Tuppence reflected, should have returned to normal. But something was nagging at her. A small detail that didn't quite fit, a thread she couldn't quite pull. "Tommy," she said slowly, "do you remember what Constance said in the Great Hall, when she was holding the pistol?" "Which part?" "She said quite a lot. She said someone else tried to kill Captain Ashford, that it wasn't her. She was lying to deflect suspicion, but Carmichael confirmed it. He said he'd tried to run Ashford down with a motor car." Tuppence set down her teacup with a definitive click. "But Tommy, Carmichael doesn't drive. He mentioned it during our first dinner at the Manor. Said he'd never learned. Relied on his housekeeper to take him on calls." Tommy lowered his newspaper. "Are you suggesting—" "I'm suggesting that someone else tried to kill Captain Ashford. And if that's true, then perhaps someone else was involved in Edmund's death as well." But Constance confessed. to manslaughter, to struggling with Edmund and his falling. But what if someone else pushed him? What if Constance arrived after he was already dead? Panicked because she knew her secret would be exposed, and took credit for his death to protect Violet. Tommy breathed. No! But even as Tuppence said it, pieces were clicking into place with horrible clarity. Oh God, Tommy! Violet was the one who supposedly heard arguing. Violet led us to the journal. Violet knew exactly where to look in the painting for the cipher. She said she'd worked on it with her father, knew all about the letters in the embroidery. She stood to inherit if she solved the cipher, Tommy said slowly, and if the evidence of her criminal ancestry was destroyed. They looked at each other for a long moment. Then Tommy was on his feet, reaching for his coat. We need to get back to Sussex now. The drive seemed to take forever, though Tommy pushed the motorcar to its limits. By the time they reached Hartwell Manor, the sun was setting and the old house glowed golden in the fading light. They found Violet in the tower room, standing before the empty space where Lady Elizabeth's portrait had hung. She'd been crying. Her eyes were red and swollen. I thought you might come back, she said quietly. You're too clever to miss the details. It was you, wasn't it? Tuppence's voice was gentle. You killed your father. Violet nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. I didn't mean to. I swear I didn't mean to. But he was going to expose everything. Mother's ancestry, the scandal, all of it. Richard and I would never have been able to marry. His family is so proper, so concerned with reputation. They'd never have accepted me as the descendant of murderers and thieves. So you came to the tower that night to stop him, Tommy said. I tried to reason with him, but Father was so stubborn, so principled. He said the truth mattered more than social standing, that we'd survive the scandal. Her laugh was bitter, easy for him to say. He wouldn't have been the one cut by society, whispering about, pitied. And in the struggle, he fell, or I pushed him. I honestly don't remember. One moment we were arguing by the window, and the next he was lying at the bottom of the stairs. She wiped her eyes. Mother found me there, standing over his body. She assumed I'd done it deliberately, tried to get me to leave, to let her take the blame. But I couldn't let her do that. So you both kept quiet, Tuppence said. Let the police rule it an accident, until you arrived and started investigating. Then Mother panicked and made her own confession, thinking she could protect me by claiming manslaughter. Violet's voice broke. She's in prison because of me, an innocent woman, locked away for 12 years. She's not entirely innocent, Tommy pointed out. She stole the painting, assaulted Gerald, staged her own poisoning, and she was complicit in covering up your father's death. But she didn't kill him. I did. Violet straightened her shoulders. That's why I asked you to come back. I'm going to confess. It's the only way to free Mother. She doesn't deserve to be punished for my crime. What about Captain Ashford? Tuppence asked. Did you try to kill him too? Violet looked shocked. No, I love Richard. I'd never hurt him. Then who? Tommy began, but he was interrupted by a sound from the doorway. Captain Ashford stood there, and for the first time since they'd met him, his pleasant expression was gone, replaced by something cold and calculating. I'm afraid that was me, he said calmly. You see, I've known about Violet's family connection to Blackwood for months. Did my own research when we started courting. Wanted to make sure there were no dark secrets that might embarrass my family later. When I discovered the truth, I saw an opportunity. An opportunity? Violet stared at him in horror. To secure a fortune, my dear. I encouraged you to confide in me about your father's investigation. I suggested that perhaps he should meet with an accident before he could announce his discovery. I even provided the brandy that was found in his room. Told you it would be good for his heart condition. His smile was chilling. I didn't expect you to actually push him, of course. That was a pleasant surprise. Made everything so much easier. You manipulated me, Violet whispered. You made me think Father's death was the only way to protect our future together. And it worked perfectly, until these two started poking about. Ashford pulled out a pistol, a military model, efficient and deadly. When I realized they were getting too close to the truth, I staged my own near-death to throw suspicion elsewhere. Would have worked, too, if they'd been slightly less observant. "You're going to kill us all?" Tommy asked, carefully positioning himself between the pistol and Tuppence. "Just you two, actually. I'll tell everyone that Violet, overcome with guilt, murdered you before turning the gun on herself. Tragic end to a tragic situation. And I'll inherit the estate as her grieving fiancé. She's already updated her will to include me." "Rather cold-blooded," Tuppence observed, "for someone who was supposedly in love." "Love?" Ashford laughed. "I'm drowning in debt, Mrs. Beresford. Lost everything in bad investments. I needed a wealthy wife and a fortune to restore my reputation. Violet and the Hartwell estate were perfect. Especially once I'd eliminated the father and ensured she'd be too guilt-ridden to ever contradict whatever story I told." He raised the pistol, taking careful aim at Tommy and Gerald Hartwell, who'd been creeping up the tower stairs with commendable stealth, swung a medieval sword, liberated from the suit of armor on the landing, directly into Ashford's knees. The captain went down with a scream. The pistol skittered across the floor, and this time when the village constable was summoned, it was to arrest a genuine murderer, or at least an accomplice to manslaughter and an attempted murderer in his own right. A month later, Tommy and Tuppence sat in their favourite tea shop in London, enjoying cucumber sandwiches and watching the world go by beyond the windows. "Rather a complicated case in the end," Tommy observed, selecting a particularly fine scone. "Multiple guilty parties, false confessions, and a villain who turned out to be the supposedly innocent fiancé. Always the ones you least suspect," Tuppence said with satisfaction. "Though to be fair, I had my doubts about Captain Ashford from the start. Too earnest by half. You suspected everyone from the start. And I was right, wasn't I? More or less. The Hartwell case had concluded as well as could be expected. Violet had confessed to pushing her father. But given the circumstances, Ashford's manipulation, her youth, her genuine remorse, she'd been sentenced to only 5 years for manslaughter. Her mother's sentence had been reduced accordingly, and both women were serving their time at a comfortable minimum security facility where, according to Gerald's letters, they'd become quite close. Dr. Carmichael's death sentence had indeed been commuted to life imprisonment, where he was reportedly writing his memoirs and attempting to paint himself as the victim of circumstance. Captain Ashford, on the other hand, had been convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and 3 counts of attempted murder. He would be spending a very long time behind bars. With no possibility of parole, Gerald had inherited the estate, there being no other direct heirs with clean hands, and had announced his intention to turn Hartwell Manor into a museum dedicated to Lady Elizabeth and the history of 18th century crime. He'd offered to make Tommy and Tuppence honorary curators, an offer they'd politely declined. "Though the £1,000 was nice," Tuppence said, helping herself to a jam tart. "Very nice indeed. We earned it," Tommy said. "Solved a murder, 2 attempted murders, a century-old cipher, and exposed a criminal conspiracy spanning 3 generations. All in a week's work for the Beresfords. Hardly a week. It was nearly 2 weeks. Don't be pedantic, darling. It ruins the moment." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. watching a street performer juggle outside the tea shop window. "You know what's odd?" Tuppence said suddenly. "That last entry in Lady Elizabeth's journal, the one where she started to write what Marcus Blackwood really was before the pages were torn out." "What about it?" "Gerald had the journal. He says he found it in the tower room, but some of those pages had clearly been removed recently. The tears were fresh, not yellowed like the rest of the binding." Tommy set down his teacup carefully. "You're suggesting Gerald removed pages. I'm suggesting someone did. And Gerald was very conveniently the one who discovered the journal and found the stolen painting in the cellars." Tuppence's eyes gleamed with the light of detection. What if there was more to Lady Elizabeth's evidence than we found? What if someone, possibly Gerald, removed pages that implicated another branch of the family? His own, perhaps. Oh, for heaven's sake, Tuppence. The case is closed. Everyone's been sentenced. Justice has been served, but has it? Tuppence leaned forward conspiratorially. What if Gerald hired us precisely to solve only part of the mystery? What if there's another secret still hidden in Hartwell Manor, waiting for clever investigators to discover it? Then it can wait for other clever investigators, Tommy said firmly. We're retired from the Hartwell case, permanently. Are we, though? Tuppence pulled a cream-coloured envelope from her handbag and placed it on the table between them. The handwriting was familiar, elaborate, old-fashioned, executed in violet ink. Not another letter from Mrs. Hartwell? Tommy groaned. From Gerald, actually. He's noticed some peculiar financial discrepancies in the estate accounts. Money that went missing around the time his father died. He thinks someone may have been embezzling, and he'd very much like us to investigate. Tommy looked at his wife, at her bright eyes and eager expression, at the way she leaned forward with barely suppressed excitement, and felt the familiar tug of the hunt beginning all over again. "How much is he offering?" he asked, surrendering to the inevitable. £200, plus expenses, and the use of the West Wing for as long as it takes. The West Wing has that lovely view of the gardens, Tommy said thoughtfully. It does. And you've already accepted, haven't you? I may have sent a telegram this morning saying we'd be delighted to investigate. Tommy sighed, but he was smiling. You know, most wives would be content with quiet domesticity. Perhaps some gardening, maybe watercolour painting as a hobby. How dreadfully dull that sounds. Tuppence grinned at him. Admit it, darling, you're just as curious as I am. What happened to that money? And more importantly, what was on those missing pages from Lady Elizabeth's journal? I suppose we'll have to return to Meadowbrook to find out. We'll leave tomorrow morning. I've already packed your bag. Of course you have. Outside the tea shop, the sun broke through the London clouds, casting everything in golden light. A church bell chimed the hour. Somewhere in the distance, a car horn honked, and Tommy and Tuppence Beresford, amateur detectives and partners in crime-solving, finished their tea and began planning their next investigation. Because mysteries, like secrets, had a way of multiplying. And some things, some dark family histories, some hidden truths, never really stayed buried. Not when there were clever people willing to dig them up. Though I do think, Tommy said as they gathered their things to leave, that we should establish a firm rule. No more cases involving paintings with ciphers. They're dreadfully complicated. Agreed, Tuppence said cheerfully. Next time we'll stick to something simple, like international espionage or buried treasure. That's not simple. Simpler than family trees and century-old murders. Certainly. They stepped out into the London afternoon, arm in arm, ready for whatever came next. And in Meadowbrook, in a tower room in an ancient manor house, Lady Elizabeth's portrait, or rather, a high-quality reproduction of it, the original being in a museum, hung on the wall, her painted eyes watching, knowing, keeping one last secret. Some mysteries, after all, deserve to remain unsolved, at least for now.